so there are only 15 teams that can win the national championship in college football this year. How do you know? Well, I don't, but this is according to the blue chip ratio. If you're wondering, hey man, what's the blue chip ratio? The blue chip ratio is a metric put forth by Bud Elliott at 24/7 Sports. And what he has done over the years is collected the recruiting rankings of teams that have won the national championship. And based on that, he's looked for the commonality. And what it comes down to simply is to win a national championship, you have to sign more 4- and 5-star recruits than 2- and 3-star recruits over the previous 4 recruiting classes. So again, you have to have a better than 50% of your class 4- and 5-stars instead of 2- and 3-stars. That's been the case for, it was the case for LSU this past year, as 64% of their scholarship players were either 4 or 5 stars. Clemson a year ago, 61%. Bama the year they beat Georgia, 80% of the roster, 4 and 5 stars. Clemson in 2016 had 52%. Bama in 2015 was 77%. Back in 2014, Ohio State won the national championship, 68%. Go back to 2013, Florida State, 53%. 2012, Bama at 71%. 2011, Bama, 71%. So that's the benchmark. You have to have more, 50% of your roster has to be 4- and 5-star recruits. 50% or more of your roster has to have been 4- or 5-star recruits. Just because you meet that criteria doesn't mean you will win a national championship, but you cannot win it without that criteria. That has certainly been the case. So you might be wondering, what's the list? Well, just for the record, there are 15 teams this year that meet this criteria. So only these 15 teams have a chance of winning the national championship. A year ago, there were 16 teams. And if you're wondering, from 2014 to 2018, the number was 12. All right, here you go. Here's the list. The 15 teams that, based on the blue chip ratio, have a chance to win the national championship in 2020. Alabama at the top of the list with 83%. Next is Georgia at 82% and Ohio State at 80%. After those three, big drop-off. And then you have a clump of 5 programs. Texas, 64%. LSU, Oklahoma, Clemson, Florida, all at 63%. Then Michigan, Auburn, Penn State, each at 59%. Notre Dame, 56% of their roster, 4- and 5-star recruits. University of Washington, 54%. And then just making it, Southern Cal and Texas A&M, each at 50% on the number. And the really interesting thing is that A&M is the new team in the list. And A&M made it by the slimmest of margins. They were actually at 49.5%, but the algorithm rounds up. Meanwhile, Florida State and Miami this year punted from this metric, 49.4%. So those two out, Texas A&M in, the two teams closest, Tennessee and Oregon, each at 40%. So not quite there, but closer. The most interesting thing on this list for me, of course, we're going to keep an eye on LSU at 63%. So Bama, Georgia, Ohio State, all head and shoulders above everybody else. Then Texas, LSU, Oklahoma, Clemson, Florida. Most interesting to me, I would have figured Clemson would be higher. And I think something this speaks to is just how manageable Clemson's schedule is playing in that league. Playing in a weak ACC where they are so far head and shoulders above everybody else in that league, it essentially grants them a spot in the playoff every year. They're the only team from the ACC on this list. Same can be said for Oklahoma, the only team from the Big 12 on this list. That's why you continue to see those two teams make it into the playoff every single year. But of course, as I mentioned, the two teams that I find most interesting in the SEC this year, Florida and Texas A&M, both are on this list. Now, A&M barely on the list, but Florida's right there with an equal roster to LSU as far as the number of 4- and 5-star recruits, an equal roster to Clemson and Oklahoma. And then there's Texas as well at 64%. So LSU's going to play Alabama, Texas, Florida, Auburn, and A&M. LSU's going to play 5 of the teams on this list that have a chance of winning the national championship this year. It's interesting, makes a lot of sense, but it also speaks to why recruiting is the lifeblood of college football. So the blue chip ratio, something 24/7 Sports puts out, and according to this metric, you have to have at least 50% of your roster being 4- and 5-star recruits to even have an opportunity to win the national championship. 15 teams meet that criteria, and I would venture a guess that this year's national championship will come from among those 15 yet again.